At 6 in the morning, I opened my cabin door to find the HOA president standing there with two sheriff's deputies waving a demolition order like it was a trophy. Snow swirled around her boots, her perfume cutting through the freezing mountain air. She was ready to bulldoze the only place I had left in this world. But what she didn't know was that my cabin sat entirely on federal forest land, and by the time the day was over, her whole empire would come crashing down. My name's Jake Blackwood. 3 years ago, I lost my wife, Sarah, to cancer. After the funeral, I couldn't stay in our suburban home anymore. It felt like living inside a ghost. So I packed up, grabbed my dog Ranger, and moved to the 2 acres my grandfather left me in the Colorado mountains. The land sat at 8,500 feet, surrounded by pines so tall they whispered when the wind blew. I built that cabin myself, one board at a time, a little piece of peace carved out of grief. I got every permit, every inspection approved. I followed every rule. I thought that meant I'd be left alone. Then came Linda Cromwell, the kind of woman who treats a neighborhood like her personal kingdom. Mid-40s, flawless hair drives a white Escalade that's somehow spotless on a dirt road. She moved in about 18 months ago and joined the HOA within a week. 2 weeks later, she was president. She called it bringing standards back. I called it a power trip in designer boots. One crisp October morning, she marched up my driveway with her clipboard and camera like she was documenting a crime scene. "Mr. Blackwood, your structure violates multiple HOA standards," she said, snapping photos of my solar panels. I told her plainly, "Ma'am, this land's been in my family since 1987. I never signed any HOA documents." Her laugh was sharp enough to cut metal. "All properties in this subdivision are under the association," she said. "You'll need to pay a $500 review fee and comply immediately." She pointed at my rain barrels. "Those have to go." Within a week, letters started showing up. Threats, fines, photos of my property like she had nothing better to do. People who used to wave at me suddenly looked away. Word was spreading that I was hurting property values. I remember sitting alone at my table one night, papers spread out reading my grandfather's old deed by lamplight. The paper was yellowed, the ink fading, but those iron survey markers he placed decades ago were still there exactly where he left them. When I compared them to Linda's maps, something didn't line up. I called the county clerk, an old-timer named Bob, and he confirmed my hunch. "Jake," he said, "there's a mapping discrepancy on your plot. Always been there, but no one's questioned it." That's when the first seed of resistance took root. 2 weeks later, I got a thick, certified letter from the HOA demanding I pay $500 immediately, plus $50 a day in fines until I brought my cabin into compliance. She'd even copied the sheriff's department and county building office, trying to flex authority she didn't have. I drove straight to Bob's office, handed him the letter. He laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. "Son," he said, "this lady's got as much power over county-approved structures as my neighbor's cat has over NASA. Every permit in my file was valid, every inspection passed." And then he told me something even better. Linda's HOA registration with the state had expired 6 months ago. She wasn't even a legal organization. That day, I realized her authority was nothing but smoke and perfume. But Linda wasn't the kind of person who backs down. She doubled down, filed a noise complaint about my generator. The deputy who came, Martinez, looked embarrassed just standing there. "Sir, I have to check," he said, glancing around at nothing but forest. I showed him the state business registry on my phone. The HOA was inactive. His eyebrows shot up. "Ma'am's been filing a lot of complaints lately," he admitted. That's when I saw my first glimmer of hope. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I'd brought this on myself. Maybe my grief had made me stubborn. Maybe I should have just paid the fee and kept the peace. I remember sitting by the fire that night, staring at Sarah's photo, wondering what she'd say. "You never let bullies win," she'd told me once. That was all I needed. I wasn't quitting. Linda's next move was pure theater. She organized a community safety meeting at the local center, invited half the county, including a building inspector, claiming my cabin was dangerous. I showed up with a folder thicker than a Denver phone book. She started her slideshow projecting photos of my solar panels like evidence in a murder trial. When she finished, I stood and calmly handed my documents to Inspector Williams. "Here's every permit inspection and approval," I said. He flipped through the pages, then looked at the crowd. "Mr. Blackwood's cabin doesn't just meet code," he said. "It exceeds it. Most suburban homes aren't this safe." The silence that followed was beautiful. Then I asked the room, "Why is the HOA's mailing address the same as Linda's real estate office?" You could feel the shift. Neighbors started whispering. I walked out that night knowing the tide had turned. A week later, Linda played her nuclear card. 2 sheriff's cars pulled up outside my cabin on December 23rd. A process server handed me an emergency demolition order. Linda stood behind him wrapped in a designer coat, smirking. "This structure is coming down tomorrow," she said. My dog growled low. I turned on my phone camera and faced the deputies. "Gentlemen, I said you can't enforce private HOA demands without a court order." They looked at each other. "Ma'am told us this was from the county," one said. I handed him the letter from the building department verifying my cabin was 100% legal. Then Linda made the mistake that sealed her fate. She sneered. "Maybe if you weren't a lonely widower losing his mind in the woods, you'd understand community standards." Even the deputies froze. Ma'am Martinez said sharply, "You need to step back." The air went dead silent. That was the first time she looked scared. Christmas Day, while she was probably sipping champagne in Denver, I strapped on snowshoes and hiked into the forest. I was following a story my grandfather once told me about old Federal Survey markers buried deep in the woods. Half a mile uphill, I found them heavy iron posts stamped U.S. Forest Service 1923. I checked the GPS. My entire property cabin solar panels, everything sat inside Arapahoe National Forest, which meant I'd never actually owned private land. It was federal property the county had been taxing by mistake for decades. I called the Forest Service, explained everything. The woman on the line actually laughed. "If that's true, Mr. Blackwood, no HOA can touch you. They have zero jurisdiction on federal land." I stood there in the snow, wind biting my face, and laughed too. Linda hadn't just picked on the wrong veteran, she'd picked a fight with the U.S. government. Over the next few weeks, I built my case with military precision. I contacted the FBI's white-collar division, handed over every document, fraudulent liens, threats, forged fines. Bob at the county gave me official records. Katie Martinez, a local journalist, started investigating. Turns out, Linda had been targeting residents for months, bullying widows and veterans, forcing them to sell, then flipping their homes through her real estate agency. She was running an extortion racket disguised as community improvement. By mid-January, Linda was desperate. She hired private security, 2 guys in a rusted pickup who sat at the end of my driveway taking photos. They looked more like hungover construction workers than professionals. One fell asleep in his truck during his shift. Roy, my veteran neighbor, called me furious. "Jake, she's got those idiots following the widow Patterson to her mailbox." 80 years old, scared out of her mind. That's when I knew it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about stopping her for good. On January 12th, I got a final certified letter from Linda demanding I demolish my cabin within 72 hours or face federal prosecution. She even copied the sheriff's department, the county, and the local newspaper. She'd just committed extortion in writing and handed me the evidence herself. I sent it straight to the FBI. January 15th, her emergency community meeting. She'd rented extra chairs, hired a photographer, and was dressed like she was hosting a courtroom drama. The place was packed. I walked in carrying one manila folder. When she started her speech, her tone dripped with arrogance. "We're here tonight because one resident poses an ongoing threat to our property values," she said, pointing at me. Her slideshow showed my cabin from every angle. "He refuses to comply, and we will pursue maximum penalties under federal law." That was my cue. I stood slowly. "Ma'am," I said, "before you embarrass yourself further, you might want to see what the United States Forest Service has to say about your authority." The room went silent. I held up the official federal survey documents. This land has been federal property since 1923. You've been filing fraudulent liens extorting residents and claiming power over government land. The color drained from her face. That's when two people in the back stood up, badges flashing. Ms. Cromwell, one said, "I'm Special Agent Rodriguez with the FBI. You're under arrest for wire fraud, attempted extortion, and filing false claims against federal property." The sound of handcuffs snapping shut was the most satisfying noise I'd ever heard. Linda stammered, "You can't do this." "I was protecting property values." Rodriguez just shook his head. "Ma'am, you've got about as much authority over federal land as you do over the Pentagon parking lot." The crowd broke into applause as they led her out. Cameras flashed, neighbors cheered, and for the first time in months, the mountain felt calm again. I didn't stay to watch the aftermath. I stepped outside into the cold night snow, crunching under my boots, the air sharp with pine and justice. Ranger trotted beside me, tail wagging like he knew the war was over. I looked toward the dark tree line where my cabin stood small, quiet, but finally safe. Sometimes it takes just one person standing up to remind everyone that bullies only have power until someone calls their bluff.